we start, I just have to tell you guys. So, when I was back in college, I I lived by my grandma, and I used to go to her house every weekend and just like hang out with her. She lived alone, and I seriously loved her so much. Anyway, she had this big house, and I would go there and just kind of decompress from like college life, you know. Anyway, I have these vivid memories of spending like every Sunday with her, and we would go out to eat, which is actually really hard to do on a Sunday in Utah because everything shuts down. But anyway, we would go eat lunch, and then I would sit and watch either like True Hollywood Stories or VH1 Behind the Music. Do you guys remember those? Anyway, that was kind of a tangent, but today's case totally reminds me of like an True Hollywood Story. So let's get into our case. Dorothy Ruth Hoog Stratten was born at Grace Memorial Hospital in Vancouver on February 28th, 1960. Her parents, Simon and Nellie Hoog Stratten, had actually immigrated from the Netherlands to Canada, where they raised their 3 children, Dorothy and her younger brother and sister. John and Louise were their names. So when the children were all still young, Dorothy's dad split, and so her mother was left to care for the family on her own. And this was, of course, very difficult, and the family really struggled financially. So by 1977, 17-year-old Dorothy was enrolled in high school at Centennial High, and she was also working this like part-time job at Dairy Queen to help try and support her family. Dorothy had worked at this Dairy Queen for the last 4 years, and her mother worked as a cafeteria worker, and they both were just trying to help with like the family expenses. It was at this Dairy Queen that Dorothy would meet a guy named Paul, and he was an automotive and cycling show promoter, and he made pretty good money doing that, but he really wanted a more extravagant lifestyle. So he began to procure girls and pimp them out on the side. He was 10 years older than Dorothy, and apparently, like, one look at her, and he was obsessed. Paul was described in an ABC News article by Lauren Evron as, quote, a local pimp with dreams of Hollywood fame, end quote. He was kind of like a flashy guy. He drove a black Corvette. He wore a mink coat, and a gold Star of David encrusted necklace that hung on his chest. He was called the Jewish pimp, and he really cultivated that. He knew that he could basically use Dorothy's beauty to make money. So he started showering her with attention and compliments. He tried to win her over by buying her stuff And she was the type that didn't really know how beautiful she was. So she was flattered by all of the attention. With the new clothes and all this attention, Dorothy kind of went through this shift where she suddenly had more self-confidence. She walked a little taller, and people really started to notice Dorothy. Paul watched as Dorothy kind of transformed right before his eyes, and he began pushing her to go into modeling. This started off with Paul taking Dorothy to have her photos taken in like her prom dress, but soon he began pushing her to model in less clothing. In fact, he kept telling her that she would be the perfect Playboy Playmate. In 1977, it was the 25th anniversary of Playboy, and they were doing this Playmate search. But Dorothy was like not interested in modeling in the nude. But he kept pushing her, telling her how life-changing this would be, how much money she could make, and how many doors this opportunity would open. And so finally, Dorothy agreed. But here's the thing. She was not like of age of consent. I think in Canada they call it the age of majority. So her mother had to sign the paperwork allowing her daughter to be photographed in the nude. And then she had to sign more paperwork so that she could like send those photos to the US, to Playboy. But her mom did go ahead and sign the paperwork. And I guess as soon as Dorothy's pictures hit the Playboy offices, they wanted to bring her to the US and photograph her. So they flew her and Paul out to LA. It would be Dorothy's first time like ever on an airplane. Everyone was so impressed with Dorothy. The way she played to the camera, her good attitude. The photo editor at Playboy at the time was named Marilyn Garbowski, and she told ABC News, quote, "She was a total babe in the woods. I cannot remember another Playmate being that. I don't want to say naive, inexperienced, unused to her surroundings, and not used to thinking she was beautiful," end quote. So Dorothy would go on to compete in the Great Playmate Hunt, but she didn't win. She was the runner-up that year to a woman named Candy Loving. But Dorothy had something special, something that Hugh Hefner noticed right from the get-go. And soon, Dorothy was a Playboy bunny. So, she was a cocktail waitress at the Playboy Lounge in LA. And then she would go on to be Miss August in 1979. Everyone who met Dorothy would say she had something special, like a star quality. It really did seem like this experience was going to change her life. But there was only one problem. No one really liked Paul, who was just riding her coattails all the way to the bank. He was always around her, trying to propose business deals to Hugh always pushing her to do things so that he could make money. And while everyone felt like Paul was this, like, slimy guy, Dorothy liked him, and she felt like she owed him for all of her success. So I really think that Paul kind of groomed Dorothy. Remember, she was 17 when she met him, and she couldn't see that he was using her. On July 1st, 1987, Dorothy married Paul. And you guys, okay, side story. He went to America as Dorothy's boyfriend. They were dating all through her ride of, like, fame. And he would go to the mansion without her and hit on the other girls. And one time he was caught in the pool making out with another woman. So they kicked him out. But still, Dorothy marries him. And everyone around her was super bummed out that she married him. Even Hugh Hefner, I guess, tried to talk her out of this decision because they just didn't like Paul. And I think that Dorothy felt like a bit of a fish out of water. Like, she was shy, this, like, really quiet girl from a small town who was suddenly thrust into the public spotlight. She would attend these, like, exclusive Hollywood parties, and it was kind of overwhelming to her. So she stayed close to Paul because he was, like, the one person she knew back home, kind of like a security blanket, and she really leaned on him. So then she did some Playboy movies. Dorothy was in them, and she was amazing. This shy girl had so much star potential, and so she started to get parts in movies, like smaller parts, but still, she was a star. In 1980, Dorothy became Playmate of the Year, and this really kind of rocketed Dorothy to fame. Like, she was an actress. Colleen Camp, who starred alongside Dorothy in the 1981 movie They All Laughed, said of Dorothy, quote, "She was just breathtakingly beautiful. There was something otherworldly about being with her. Time would stop, and you just felt like you were frozen in a moment," end quote. So, Dorothy is becoming more and more famous, and she's also growing up. I mean, she was this super naive 18-year-old girl when she got to Hollywood. In fact, the photographer who had shot her test shots, a guy named Mario Castillo, told 2020 in a 1985 interview, quote, "When you looked at her, she was a total lady. She had this look, but when you talked to her, you could see she was still a little girl," end quote. But then was working for a guy who owned a club called Destiny 2. He was like a promoter, and he took the idea of the Playboy Lounge and kind of swapped it to make it like male strippers who were to wear these collars and work at this club. And this club would end up morphing into what we now know as Chippendales. So Paul really kind of created the idea of Chippendales, but like I said, everyone hated him, so the owners would end up kind of pushing him out. Paul and Dorothy were living in a home with 2 roommates, and one of the roommates was a woman named Patty, and Paul kind of sets his sights on her. He's like, you should model. Look at what I've done for Dorothy's career. Let me manage you. I will turn you into a star too. And I think at this point, Paul's free ride was coming to a halt, and he knew that. Dorothy wasn't just letting him like blindly lead her life anymore. She was making tons of money. She has actual agents and like accountants and lawyers, whereas before Paul was in charge of everything. So Paul is starting to get desperate. He had always thought of Dorothy as his, like he had ownership over her, and that was beginning to slip through his fingers. Filmmaker Peter Bogdanovich, who is this famous director, he's won awards, like so many awards over his lifetime. He directed The Last Picture Show, She's Funny That Way, and The Other Side of the Wind, just to name a few. But he is a big time director, and he was even back then in the 80s, and he was friends with Hugh Hefner, so he met Dorothy at a party at the mansion, and he felt like she had so much potential as an actress that he wrote a part specifically for her in his upcoming movie. And the movie was They All Laughed, starring Audrey Hepburn and John Ritter. Now, Peter, a little background on him, he had left his wife for Sybil Shepherd while he was directing The Last Picture Show, which Sybil had starred in. And at the time that he's getting ready to film They All Laughed, he had just split from Sybil. And there was definitely some chemistry between Dorothy and Peter. So Dorothy is getting ready to head to New York to film They All Laughed. And Paul, of course, wants to go with Dorothy. But she's like, no, like this is my big break into like the acting scene, the film scene, and I need to focus, and I can't have you there. I won't be focusing. Plus, their relationship was on the rocks anyway, and she just didn't want him there. Dorothy was reportedly just a dream on set. She was a super easygoing actress. She came prepared. She knew her lines. She gave it her all and just kind of went with the flow. And Dorothy soon began having an affair with Peter. Dorothy quietly checked out of the hotel room that she was living in and moved in to Peter's hotel room. And they tried to keep this quiet, but these rumors kind of kept going. This trip to New York was the perfect way for Dorothy to separate herself from Paul and to think about what she wanted. And then it was the perfect way to end the relationship because he wasn't there. So Paul is calling her nonstop and she's just not answering, not calling him back. This was back before cell phones, so it was kind of easier for her to miss his calls. At one point, Dorothy was trying to end things with Paul, and she reportedly told him, quote, "Let the bird fly," end quote. There was this filming break, and Dorothy was headed back to LA to do some PR for the film, and she had some appearances to do. And then she was gonna go back to Vancouver because her mom was actually getting remarried. So she was going to her mother's wedding, and Paul was planning on going with her because they're still married at this point. But around this time, Dorothy's friends started to become concerned because Paul was a desperate man. He was so possessive and controlling over her, and she had basically taken off for New York, not let him go, and had been dodging him for a few months. Dorothy was planning on officially ending things with him, and people were really concerned about how he was going to take it. I mean, without her, he's just this 30-year-old guy with nothing. But Dorothy was like always reassuring friends that she would be fine. Paul would never hurt her. So they go to the wedding, and they have this talk where she tells him she needs space. She's only 20 years old by this point, and her life has just exploded in a way she never dreamed it could. So Paul agrees to give her space, but they don't officially end things, and she heads back to New York and just continues distancing herself. Once she got back to New York, Dorothy would send Paul this official letter saying that they were now legally separated, and he was furious. I think he must have thought he had talked her into staying with him, but really, she was just over it. Paul had just basically lost everything. His prestige, his money, everything. And Paul felt like everything was falling apart. As Paul's control over Dorothy and her career rapidly just started unraveling, he became a very desperate man. Dorothy tried to smooth things over. She told him she didn't want to hurt him, but they had married when she was so young, and she just didn't want to be with him anymore. But Paul, he wasn't okay with this. Dorothy was his, and if he couldn't have her, then no investigator to track her down. And I don't know what he wanted. Like, she was obviously over him. She was still sending him money. I think she still at this point felt like he was the one who launched her career or something, so she owed him. On August 8th, she went to her home, and like her and Paul's home, to get all of her stuff. Like, she was moving in with her boyfriend, and she talked to Paul. She was trying to end things on a good note. She took her stuff and she left. Now the two still had to figure out their, like, a financial split, but they were gonna do that another time. So then Paul borrowed a .38 revolver from a friend, and he sat outside of Peter's home for 2 hours trying to talk himself into, like, going into the house. But he didn't, and a few days later he gave his friend the gun back and went and bought a 12-gauge shotgun. And Paul must have been acting like so obsessive about Dorothy, because at this point everyone in her life really started to worry about her safety. Like, people are telling her, do not meet him alone, do not talk to him. Robert and Hugh Hefner both were like, never be alone with him. But like I said, Dorothy was kind of naive, and I think she had, like, almost guilt when it came to Paul. Like, he had launched her career and she would be nothing without him or something. So she arranges to meet Paul in their home. Like, she goes alone to meet him. On August 14th, 1980, she drives to the home and parks her car in the driveway around 11:30. Patty and Stephen, who are the roommates, were not home at this time. Dorothy is thinking her and Paul will sit down and settle their finances, and then she would leave. She was going to give him $7,000. No one will ever know exactly what happened in that home that day. It wouldn't be until the medical examiner performed autopsies on the bodies the police began to form a timeline and a theory of what had gone down. They know that Patty came home at 5 p.m. for a couple minutes, but then she left to go out with some friends. The door to Paul and Dorothy's room was closed, so she didn't see them, and she didn't go into the room. She didn't want to intrude on whatever was going on in the room. When Stephen got home, the door was closed, but he felt like something was off about it, because the whole house was quiet. Dorothy's car was in the driveway, so he knew she was there. But over the last few months, whenever Paul and Dorothy were together, they were yelling at each other. So the fact that it was so quiet in there was super suspicious. But he too doesn't want to intrude, so he had a dog, and he lets the dog out of his room where he keeps the dog when he isn't home. And the dog goes over to Paul's room and stands outside the door and starts whining. remember the PI that Paul had hired? Well, he had told Paul to wear a wire during this financial meeting with Dorothy, so they could record everything she said to use it against her in court. So I guess this PI was waiting, expecting to hear from Paul about how the meeting went, how the recording went, and he started to get worried when he couldn't get a hold of him for hours. So he called Patty, the roommate, and was like, will you go in the room and make sure everything's okay in there? And at this point, she's too freaked out. She knows something awful has happened and she doesn't want to go in. So Steven, the other roommate, is like, I'll check inside. He opened the door to find the nude bodies of Paul and Dorothy lying face down on the floor. Paul had sexually assaulted Dorothy and then shot her in the face. And then Paul had turned the gun on himself. When he was found, he had fistfuls of Dorothy's hair in his hands. So whatever happened had been violent. This news shocked the community. For whatever reason, Hugh Hefner was one of the first people to find out about this, and he was the one who called Peter, Dorothy's boyfriend, and broke the news to him. Both Hugh and Peter were devastated by Dorothy's death. Dorothy was buried in the same Los Angeles cemetery as Marilyn Monroe. Peter chose the inscription on her tombstone, a quote from Ernest Hemingway's novel, A Farewell to Arms, which said, quote, "If people bring too much courage to this world, the world has to kill them, to break them. So, of course, it kills them. It kills the very good, and the very gentle, and the very brave. Impartially, if you are none of these, you can be sure that it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry." End quote. Peter would go on to take care of Dorothy's family for years after she died, including our younger sister, Louise. He would later say, quote, "If I had married Dorothy, this would be my family. So I wasn't going to stop being their family because she was dead." End quote. Peter later went on to date Louise, Dorothy's sister, and they ended up getting married 8 years after Dorothy's death. And then they divorced in 2001. And this is the Dorothy Stratten story. I just quickly want to cite my sources for this video. I got information from a people.com article by Steve Helling titled "How the Brutal Murder of a Playboy Centerfold Sent Shockwaves Through Hollywood." An ABC News article, which